My name is Josh Luker. I'm with the Workers International League, and I'm also currently a member of CWA Local 37002. Obviously speaking in personal capacity here. But the reason we chose this topic, Workers International League chose this topic about the crisis of leadership, we feel that this question is really the most pressing question facing the working class and really humanity on a world scale. Leon Trotsky, a leader of the Russian Revolution, called the crisis of the 20th century the crisis of the leadership of the working class. And it's true, if you look at the history of the 20th century, the last century, you see time and time again, the masses move to try to change their conditions, to try to take their destiny in their own hands. For example, look at Spain in the 1930s, where the mass of workers and peasants could have made not one, but 10 revolutions if it wasn't for the betrayals of the Stalinist leadership of the Communist Party, or of the vacillations of the various other leaderships of the other organizations of the Spanish left of the Republican camp. And really, the failure there in Spain and elsewhere in the 20th century to find a revolutionary solution to the problems facing society is not the fault of the masses themselves, but the fault of their leaders. And we see today that the crisis of the 20th century has now become the crisis of the 21st. As once again, time and time again, since the turn of the century, the masses have taken to the streets to try to change their conditions, to transform their lives. Just this past year, beginning earlier this year, we saw the inspiring movement of workers, of youth, and of women throughout the Arab world, beginning in Tunisia with the movement against the dictator Ben Ali, and then in Egypt with the movement against Mubarak. And these two movements were revolutionary movements because in our opinion, what a revolution is when the masses, who normally sit by the sidelines and leave politics to professionals, take to the streets and begin to take their destiny into their own hands and become a historical force, become the active sort of protagonist in the historical process. And then moving on into the year, it was the inspiring movement of workers, public sector workers in Madison against Walker's anti-union bill. And throughout the summer, there were movements of youth, beginning in Spain with the movement of the Indignados, and then in Greece and in Britain. And then most recently, there's been the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Occupy movement, which has been sort of shaking things up here. And that's all taken place in the last year. And it's really more and more the case that we can talk realistically about speak objectively, about an unfolding world revolution. Obviously taking place at an uneven pace, at a sort of protracted pace, but nonetheless, the working class is moving on a world scale to change its conditions. But what has been the outcome of these movements, which is what we're concerned about here? If you look at Tunisia and in Egypt, yes, these movements were successful at overthrowing the dictators, but I'm sure everyone's seen the recent street protests in Egypt. And that's because in both of these cases, in Tunisia and in Egypt, while they overthrew the dictators, the social questions, which also led to the uprisings in these countries, have not been dealt with. Jobs are still scarce, wages are still low, and social services remain either underfunded or non-existent. While closer to home in Wisconsin, a movement which began largely as a grassroots movement has been successfully diverted into the channels of the Democratic Party. And there's those who would like to do the same thing to the Occupy movement. In Greece and throughout Europe, the movement sort of at a stalemate, while the masses sort of struggled heroically, particularly the youth, struggled courageously on the streets. Nonetheless, there's sort of an effort to ram through these austerity measures, these cuts to social services in the public sector, without even the regard for the appearance of democracy. And so the question is, how does this consistently happen to all of these movements? How do they consistently end up diverted? And in my opinion, that question, the answer to that question is leadership. Many of these movements in this past year have claimed to be leaderless. Now, of course, I would argue this is not true. And can't be true. Politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And where there's a vacuum of revolutionary leadership, that leadership is going to be filled. That void is going to be filled. And in all of these cases, that vacuum has been filled by reformists. In the case of Egypt, it was filled by the military in alliance with pro-capitalist elements. In Wisconsin, I was actually able to witness firsthand the co-opting of the movement there, which where was I at? which diverted that mass energy, which at the time I was there, I was actually discussing openly the question of a general strike into a safe recall effort aimed at electing Democrats to state office. Most recently, the leadership of the Occupy movement has also claimed that this movement also is leaderless. And this is true in one sense only. It's true in the sense that there's not yet emerged a national leadership of the Occupy movement that yet has the authority to subvert the will of Occupy. Although I'm sure everyone's seen recently the statements and attempts by people like Van Jones and others to quote occupy Congress or occupy the Democratic Party in order to do just that. Also, anyone who's actually participated in Occupy St. Louis or any of the other Occupy movements nationally, if they're honest with themselves, I think can admit that these movements definitely have a leadership. Now, whether that leadership is elected, accountable, and recallable is another matter, but they definitely have leadership. Now, to a certain extent, the opposition to leadership and the desire for leaderlessness flows from a healthy rejection of the current leadership of what we call the mass organizations. In the U.S., that means mass organizations of the working class. In the U.S., that means the trade unions. Throughout most of the rest of the world, that includes what we call the mass workers' parties. We don't have those in the U.S. We have two capitalist parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, like we talked about in the last session. But most of the rest of the world has workers' parties. They have social democratic parties, labor parties, socialist parties, communist parties, and so forth. But the leadership of all of these parties accepts the continued rule of capital, believe it or not. Nonetheless, these parties exist, and they exercise leadership over these movements. And actually, the authority of these organizations actually often flows from these organizations having led important struggles in the past. So they flow from the sort of collective memory and traditions of the working class itself. So for example, let's take the movement in Wisconsin, which, like I said, began as a very grassroots movement. It began as even somewhat leaderless to a certain extent. And it unleashed massive energy, culminated in huge rallies at the Capitol. I was able to participate in the largest of these rallies, which had 250,000 people at it. And I'll tell you, the atmosphere of this rally was really electric. I really experienced nothing like it since, and I've been active for over 10 years. And I haven't experienced anything since. I hadn't experienced anything up to that point. But I do have confidence that we'll all experience something like that in the near future. But you could come up in Madison during this massive rally. You could come up to any random person on the street, and you could discuss with them the question of a general strike. And whether they agreed or disagreed with you on the question, they had an opinion about this particular question. But despite that, basically due to the failure of the labor leadership to provide a clear position on this question, the question of the general strike, and other important issues facing workers in Wisconsin, that is the failure of the labor leadership to lead, the Democratic Party was more than happy to step in and fill that void. And frankly, there were a lot of labor leaders, a lot of bureaucrats in positions of power who were more than happy to let them do so. And really, this is always the case when a vacuum is present. The mass of workers and youth are not going to, under normal circumstances, go looking around for small socialist and anarchist sects that they can pick from. I've talked about in the last session. Just because you slap party on the end of your little group does not mean people are going to vote for you. But they're first going to move through the traditional organizations, through organizations they've come to trust in the past. And in the case of our own organizations in the U.S., like I said, such as unions, that's why it's imperative for revolutionaries to participate in these organizations where they're able, and to make appeals on the leadership to take a proper course of action. If they fail to do so, to provide an alternative leadership. If you don't provide an alternative leadership, then you leave the rest of the working class to the whim of the existing leadership. Now, the critical thing to understand is that, yes, it's true that leadership can impose itself onto a vacuum, or can, quote, hijack a movement, as some people would say. But nonetheless, leadership, the phenomenon of leadership, exists. It's an objective fact. An advance guard, or a vanguard, is a natural byproduct of the unevenness of social consciousness. It's a fact in society that some people are going to come to a correct conclusion about a problem before others are. Now, that's nothing against the people who have not yet come to that conclusion, but nonetheless, we have to recognize this fact and understand it. In fact, we can actually take the very existence of this conference and of this workshop as direct, objective evidence of this fact. The fact that there's people in this room who have come to certain conclusions about how things cannot continue the way they're going out there in society, and that we have to transform society. And yet there's thousands of people, millions of people out there who have not yet come to that conclusion. And it's imperative, the role of leadership is to connect those people and draw them along and allow them to draw those conclusions. If you look at history, Even anarchist organizations have had leaders and leadership. If you take the example of the CNT in Spain, actually the CNT lost a lot of its authority among Spanish workers near the end of the Civil War because members of its leadership participated in the Popular Front government just against actually the will of the majority of the CNT membership. And there are those at the present time that would like to do the same thing to the Occupy movement, like I said earlier. Many of the current leadership of Occupy have had ties with the Democratic Party in the past, and they'd like to do the same thing, diverting that movement into safe channels. The question is, if we recognize that leadership exists, once we recognize that fact, what then becomes our task? Well, like I said, I'm a member of the Workers' International League, and we believe that leadership should be elected and immediately recallable. It should be accountable. I'm sure most of you can come up with examples of organizations that you may or may not have been involved in where some of these organizations that claim to be leaderless can be the most authoritarian, the most hierarchical, if for no other reason than they might not have structures for electing leadership, for keeping leadership accountable. They may not have an analysis of leadership. And we also need to bear in mind that there is no organizational fixes, there's no sort of quick fixes, rules fixes for preventing bad leadership or bureaucracy from developing. A bureaucracy can develop in a knitting club. The only way to prevent bureaucracy, bad leadership, is to have an informed membership of your organization. That's the way to prevent it in your organization. Let's see. Also, another thing, in the Workers' International, we believe, we would argue that the problem facing the working class on a world scale is not this or that policy, but rather the capitalist system itself. The real solution, therefore, is to wage a revolutionary struggle to end capitalism and replace it with socialism, with the democratic planning of the economy and the benefit of all. And therefore, it flows from that history itself demands that the leadership of organizations, of all these, or any of these movements, if they're going to be successful, has to reflect this fact. And that being said, though, we also understand that most people haven't drawn this conclusion yet. We're not delusional. Therefore, the task of revolutionaries becomes convincing people of this. A revolutionary leadership, like I said, must win people over organically. Yes, there are, like I said earlier, there are those sects, socialist sects, or individuals who would like to impose themselves on a movement. Some would say hijack a movement or something like this. Either by being the loudest on the bullhorn, being the most active, being out there all the time, something like this. But that's not the sort of leadership that the working class needs or deserves. The goal of genuine working class leadership needs to be to raise the self-consciousness, to raise the self-awareness of the working class to its own tasks. And by that I mean, I'm going to quote Marx real quick here, that the task of the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself. It can't come from outside. If you look at the capitalist revolutions of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, you see that the capitalist class had to drag the workers and peasants along with them with democratic demands in order to feudalism, but ultimately towards their own ends, in order to establish the rule of capital. On the contrary, in building a working class society, a socialist society, which would be the first time in human history where the majority class becomes the ruling class, the task of leadership is something entirely different. The task of leadership lies in like I said, raising the self-awareness and self-consciousness of the working class to the task of self-emancipation. So it's not a matter of like lording yourself over the masses or something like this. And I understand that people have, we understand that people have reasonable fears about leadership. Largely due to the damage done by Stalinism with the banner of socialism. But the question is, what is leadership? And in my opinion, leadership is the person in a movie theater, if it catches fire, that can point the way to the exit and can help people out. Under normal conditions, people are going to look to the ushers and the theater staff to try to help them out of the theater. But we shouldn't rely on the ushers and theater staff to get us out. The role of leadership in a movie theater is seeking out before the fire happens, where the exit is, what the best paths are to the exit. That's leadership. And really, revolutionary leadership is no different. The role of revolutionary leadership is to understand and absorb the history of past revolutions, of the history of struggle of the working class. Because just like in a movie theater, when a fire breaks out, that's not the best time to figure out where the exits are. When a revolution breaks out, or when an explosion of the class struggle breaks out, like what happened in Madison, Wisconsin, that's not the best time to brush up on your history of movements that are similar to those movements in order to provide guidance and to provide leadership to help those movements succeed. And organized revolutionary leadership must be the collective historical memory of the working class. And you may say to yourself, well, what does studying history have to do with leadership? What's it have to do